yours. I am so excited to present who you may know because of his wonderful blog, Introspective Digital Archaeology. And if you haven't checked it out yet, please do, because I think it will grapples in various ways with some of the subjects that will come up today. Jeremy, I find very inspiring because he's one of those people that it probes, I think, the social and philosophical implications of IT, of digital technologies, and it's something that sadly I don't think happens as much as it should. So I think without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jeremy to tell us a bit more. We live stream the seminar, so you can catch this again in the future on our YouTube channel, and you can tweet questions or ask them in person through our hashtag YOHRS. Thank you so much, and thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you very much. Right. Well, thank you very much for your warm welcome. It's really nice to be here. It's very nice to see a lot of very familiar faces, so thank you very much for your welcome. You know what it's like, someone contacts you back in the summer and says, come and do a talk in whenever it is, 6-8 months time, but I need a title and an abstract. So you produce a title and an abstract, you're racking your brains for something that, who knows, might be a little bit catchy, might help attract attention, possibly even be a little bit controversial. And I confess that I think my use of the term digital detox was probably no more than a deliberate ploy along those lines. And I found myself a few days ago trying to rack my brains to think, well, what on earth was I thinking of when I came up with that term? But I think what I hope to be able to show in the next sort of 35, 40 minutes is that the idea of a digital detox, thinking around the idea of a digital detox, really gives us an opportunity to review, rethink, and refocus in what I think can be quite a valuable way. And after all, digital detoxing has been very much in the news in the last few months. So I'm sure many of you will be aware Eddie Redmayne is a recent example. Last year, he swapped his iPhone for an old-fashioned handset, and he said it was a reaction against being glued permanently to my iPhone during my waking hours. The deluge of emails was constant. I found myself trying to keep up in real time at the expense of living in the moment. It was apparently a failed attempt. He ended up spending more time with his laptop to access his emails, and he's now back on his iPhone, trying to establish a healthier relationship with it. More recently, Jennifer Lawrence was upbraided when she took a journalist to task at the Golden Globes last month. She told him, when he kept looking at his phone, "You can't live your whole life behind your phone, bro. You've got to live in the now." That, I'm afraid, is what passes as my imitation of Jennifer Lawrence. It's as good as it gets. So close to home, some of you may remember Steve Hilton, who was David Cameron's former spin doctor in the last government. And he recently admitted that he hasn't carried a mobile phone for 3 years because he associates it with stress, tension, and anxiety. And if you're a follower of James Corden's Carpool Karaoke, you'll also know that Elton John has also just admitted recently that he doesn't carry a phone either, so he's in good company. Ed Sheeran quit social media. He said, I'm taking a break from my phone, emails, and all social media for a while. I've had such an amazing ride over the last 5 years, but I find myself seeing the world through a screen. He then apparently managed to offend Adele by suggesting that he might get an old flip phone, which she took as a dig at her long-awaited video, which shows her using her flip phone to call somebody else's landline, which then, if you've been watching, caused a great deal of consternation and curiosity as to why she was using all this old technology. 10 years ago, Thomas Friedman, the New York Times opinion columnist and also 3 times Pulitzer Prize winner, he wrote about what he called continuous partial attention. It's the consequence of our attempts to multitask when we're on the internet or we're on a cell phone whilst watching television, typing an email, typing up a paper, trying to hold a conversation with somebody all at the same time. And he called it the malady of modernity. We've gone, he said, from the Iron Age to the Industrial Age to the Information Age to the age of interruption. Now, he certainly wasn't the first person to draw attention to this. For example, back in 1971, Herbert Simon, an American political scientist and Nobel Prize winner, wrote, "In an information-rich world, the wealth of information means a dearth of something else, a scarcity of whatever it is that information consumes. What information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. Hence, the wealth of information creates a poverty of attention and a need to allocate that attention efficiently among the overabundance of information sources that might consume it." I think it's worth noticing the date, 1971. So we're talking about a period well before any personal computers, let alone mobile phones or tablet devices. And he's already talking about this question of attention. Recently, according to Pew Research, as of 2015, 65% of adult internet users in the USA are on social media. Among those aged 18 to 29, it was 89%. And just to keep the statistics going, there's a 48.4% increase in mobile screen time between 2012 and 2013 alone. So these figures are all shooting up. Amongst Americans under the age of 50 who own a smartphone, 58% check them at least once an hour, 54% check them in bed, 39% check them on the toilet. 72% of Americans check their email from home or whilst on vacation. And it's much the same here as well. There was a recent report by the Chartered Management Institute that came out in January that showed that British workers are effectively cancelling out their annual leave allowance by checking their emails outside their contracted hours. In the report, they talk about 61% of respondents stated that mobile technology makes it hard for them to switch off from work. Over half frequently check their emails outside normal working hours. 21% check it all the time, they say. Something I'm very aware of in my own workplace. I'm sure all of us have our own experiences of this. I remember that consternation I sowed amongst colleagues when I explained that the reason they didn't hear anything from me at weekends is that I wasn't answering work emails at weekends. And this was a complete shock to many people. But it's a characteristic, I think, of academics and academic life. It's not helped by a sort of no fixed hours type contract and so on and so forth. So we're in some respects, we're our own worst enemies. As a consequence, I think, of all of this, digital connectivity has become pathologized. As the need to unplug or to disconnect has in many ways become a health and well-being issue. There's a sense in which technology is toxic, it's addictive, it's unnatural, and the answer is seen to be some form of digital austerity. So perhaps rather inevitably, ironically, there are apps which can reward you for spending less time on the phone, or in the case of the bottom one, I've forgotten what this one's actually called in case you're interested in following it up. This one actually disables your phone for a period of time. Once you set it to disable your phone for, say, 3 days or 4 days or whatever, you cannot use your phone. You actually have to do a factory reset to actually get your phone back again. So it's really quite a fierce piece of software. There's even a detox app in the form of a game. This is Forest. It grows trees over time, but only if you set a timer and then don't touch your phone or your tablet until it runs out. Otherwise, a tree dies if you use another app, and you get a sort of withered, treeless stump, leafless stump in your forest as a reminder of your failure. They're sort of sales pitches that it's a game you can only win by not playing it, which is kind of nice, actually. So as well as the sort of, the apps to help us break our habit of using apps, which, as I say, is slightly sort of ironic, it seems to me, There are endless holidays available for anybody wanting to detox. I haven't put the prices up there because they are absolutely terrifying. More elaborately, you can find things like retreats, holiday camps, electronic rehab getaways. All of these are designed to facilitate a return to a more analog lifestyle. One of the more famous examples is the Digital Detox Organization. Their motto is disconnect to reconnect. And their Camp Grounded bills itself as a digital detox, tech-free personal wellness retreat. Alexis Madrigal, the senior editor at The Atlantic, calls it a pure distillation of postmodern techno-anxiety. And as he commented, it looks remarkably similar to 1967's tune-in, drop-out Summer of Love. The rules are very simple. There are no phones, there are no computers, there are no tablets or watches, there's no work talk, there's no discussion of people's ages, there's no use of real names. Campers participate in play shops featuring yoga, laughing contests and writing sessions. But apparently for many of the participants, the most exciting activity they discover is conversation. And there are even digital bath salts. For anybody interested, I've put the website up there so that you can find them afterwards when they come back into stock. These apparently attract unhealthy, positively charged radiation that accumulates in the body through the use of cell phones, laptops, and electronic devices. And through ionic exchange, aids in cellular revitalization and healing. Apparently, I was curious. And it talks about using this montmorillonite clay, which I discovered after extensive research. Okay, Wikipedia tells me that this montmorillonite clay is the fundamental component in drilling the mud that's used for drilling rigs, amongst other things. But also quite interesting, I think it struck me as interesting, so forgive me if I go on about it. It's also used, I think it's called a flocculate. It's used for pond cleaners. And the idea is you scatter it on the surface of your pond. As it sinks down through the water invisibly, it cleans your pond and you end up with the sort of sludge at the bottom. And it strikes me that that's precisely what's going on here. You put it in your bath. When you get out of your bath, there's a sort of sludge scum at the bottom, which is what contains all these unhealthy, positively charged ions, presumably. And of course, really, I suppose what that kind of brings me to is the idea that a lot of this is obviously some form of present day equivalent of snake oil, this idea of detoxifying technology. It's the sort of thing that used to be sold, is still perhaps in some areas sold by quacks and charlatans. I particularly like the idea of dehydrated water. I couldn't resist that one. So am I some sort of archaeological silicon snake oil salesman? Am I arguing, therefore, that something is wrong with archaeology, that information technology is to blame, that in some ways that an offline archaeology, a non-digital archaeology, is healthier, is more authentic than a digital archaeology, for example, is an archaeology without the digital, not after the digital, but it's without the digital. So am I, as I say, some sort of silicon snake oil salesman? Not exactly, although obviously I would say that, wouldn't I? In a recent critique of digital detoxing by Natasha Malthner from Aberdeen University, she argues that whilst detox may provide us with a fairly sort of temporary respite, we have to make up for it as soon as we plug back in. And I suspect that all of us who've had a go at this sort of detoxing, whether it's just turning your devices off for the weekend or whilst you're away on holiday, experience this. There's always this constant worry of what's going on whilst you've got the thing turned off, and this fear of the mountains of emails and goodness knows what else that's going to be waiting for you when you get back. That's why Christmas, New Year tends to be the best time to do this, because everybody else is doing it as well, so you tend to have an easier time of it. So this detoxing is often not as valuable as people think it ought to be. And she says that to be valuable and effective, the detox should provide an opportunity for recalibration. She says, disconnecting from digital technologies is like sticking our heads in the sand. It prevents us from asking how technologies are changing our lives. in particular ways, and whether it is for the better. It also stops us from reclaiming these technologies and repurposing them for different goals and values. In a critique of the campgrounded kind of approach to digital detoxification, Alexis Madrigal wrote in The Atlantic, "I refuse to accept that the only good response to an imperfect technology is to abandon it. We need more specific criticisms than the ever-present feeling that something's not right. What thing? Developing a political agenda to remake, improve, or forbid technologies requires some sort of rubric," he says. "How can I judge what I'm using? What are the deleterious impacts? How are they specific to these media and this time? Which effects are caused by the technologies, which are enabled by the technologies, and which just happen to occur through the technologies? What are the ethics? What are the mechanics? What is the baseline?" And this is really, I suppose, what interests me. I'm not arguing for a return to some pre-digital archaeology, nor am I a Luddite or a disconnectionist. In many ways, I'm as much a techno enthusiast as the next person, if not more so, since, like one other person in this room I could name, I've been using and abusing these devices in archaeological contexts for over 30 years. Digital archaeology over the years, I think, can be characterized primarily as being concerned with exploring the practical uses of computer techniques and technologies, and the computations that can be applied to different types of archaeological data in the pursuit of analysis. But I think it's done so, as Sarah said at the outset, it's done so in an environment which has been largely uncritical, where the focus has very much been on selecting and using tools appropriately, sure, but any critique has tended to primarily be restricted to debate surrounding the tools and their outputs. I think there's been a lack of a meaningful dialogue about the intervening digital technologies and their influence on the outputs, which in some respects has left archaeologists open to accusations, if only by me perhaps, of technological fetishism. And this is despite the fact that digital archaeologists work within a scientific discipline which is predicated upon an artifact, the computer, rather than necessarily just nature or culture. So I think that digital archaeology should be more ambitious, and it should be a means of rethinking archaeology rather than simply a means of a series rather of methodologies and techniques. It's not simply a matter of the technology driving these challenges. I think what are important are our ambitions for the subject, and only then the ways in which digital archaeology might be used to catalyze, to support, develop and enhance those innovations. So my objective is to examine the ways in which digital technologies may have changed what we do, how we do it, how we represent what we do, how we communicate what we do, how we understand what we do, and how others understand what we do. And the belief that computers increasingly are seen as ways of facilitating theoretical concepts like multivocality, reflexivity, the subversion of authority, these sorts of ideas are often put forward. They're quite commonplace these days. But much less so, I think, is the recognition that all too often these tools actually restrict and subvert these very ideals, and frequently disguise that they do so through a combination of technological sleight of hand and the law of unintended consequences. So what I've tried to call an introspective digital archaeology is one that consciously and deliberately sets out to understand the nature of this computational turn in archaeology and its effect on every stage of knowledge creation. So going from the theories that we developed and use to the recognition of archaeological features on and in the ground, from the definition and capture of archaeological data through to the methods of structuring and recording the data, from their manipulation and analysis through to the presentation and synthesis of the data, and ultimately through to the construction, management, publication of that resultant knowledge. So perhaps a bit of a tall order. It certainly isn't very easy to do on a number of different levels. First of all, I think that it underlines that in archaeology, the digital underpins almost everything we do these days, and certainly has increasingly done so in recent years. So what we're trying to understand is something that is already embedded in our day-to-day practice. Second problem is that as a consequence of that, we as archaeologists, as digital archaeologists, are already implicated, whether we realize it or not, consciously or unconsciously, reflectively or blithely for that matter, we're implicated in the use and application of these digital methods. And it can be quite difficult sometimes, I think, to conceive of a time before digital. I think perhaps that's something like an older person like me has an easier time of, because I can remember what these things were like before the computers came along. That's giving my age away. A third problem, I suppose, is as a consequence of the first two. Some people would argue that there's not really any point in any of this. That to be blunt, archaeology already does enough examination of the sort of theoretical fluff in its intellectual navel. And so why are we bothering with this sort of approach? Other people perhaps see, perhaps it's not worth the bother, but in the process perhaps reveal a sense of powerlessness and futility in the face of this technological onslaught. There's something that is here, we can't get away from it, we can't deny it, we can't do anything about it, we have no control ultimately over it. And of course, a fourth problem is that it's actually a very difficult thing to do, partly at least because the levels of digital abstraction that are employed to shield us from the complexities of the software, combined with the levels of literacy that are required to understand its operation, tend to conspire to hold us at arm's length, and in spite of the fact that there is this sort of often this illusion of transparency. And this is an area I want to come back and talk a little about in a bit more detail here. As Sarah said, I began a blog just over a year ago to try and help me explore some of these sorts of ideas. And looking back over the posts, apart from a certain random nature, if I'm honest about them, there is something of a theme that's sort of bubbling under that developed around software and hardware, around black boxes, around filter bubbles and algorithms. And what I want to do is to take the opportunity today to explore some of this a little bit further. And because of where I am, as you'll see later on, I'm going to use a very local case study as a means of developing the conversation a little bit further. So I'm going to focus very much on algorithms and the algorithms that sit behind all of the computer-based tools that we use. But I'm not going to be delving deep into the sort of technical stuff. I'm going to be staying at a deliberately fairly high level and talking about some of the implications of these. And this has in part been triggered by the work of people like Ted Stripfus. He's argued, for example, that our reliance on algorithms for classifying and hierarchizing people, places, objects, and ideas constitute what he calls an algorithmic culture. He describes algorithms as socio-technical assemblages which join together the human and the non-human, the culture and the computational. Another writer in the Atlantic, Ian Bogos, has actually suggested it actually goes much further than this, that he suggests that we're not living in an algorithmic culture so much as a computational theocracy. It talks about the invisibility of algorithms, giving them a transcendental, almost a divine character. It's got quite a nice quote in this article in the Atlantic. He says that in its ideological mythic incarnation, the ideal algorithm is thought to be some flawless little trifle of lithe computer code, processing data into tapestry like a robotic silkworm, a perfect flower, elegant and pristine, simple and singular, a thing you can hold in your palm and caress, a beautiful thing. It's this sort of, the attraction of the technology, I suppose, is coming through in this sort of description. In the latest issue of Science, Technology and Human Values, Malte Zewitz writes that algorithms have developed, in fact, into something of a modern myth. He says that on the one hand, they've been depicted as powerful entities that that rule, sort, govern, shape, or otherwise control our lives. On the other hand, he says their alleged obscurity and inscrutability make it difficult to understand what is exactly at stake. And he points to the way in which algorithms are perceived as powerful and consequential actors, that they are imbued with agency and impact. And yet at the same time, they are as black boxes. They're difficult to understand, which provides it's almost like a sort of recursive relationship that starts to build up, because the difficulty of understanding or appreciating their inscrutability, as he says, tends to be read as yet another sign or indication of their influence and power. So round the circle you go again, to building this myth of the algorithm. Now, one thing that I suppose everybody agrees on is that thinking about algorithms is actually quite complicated. Just consider for a moment, I said we're here, so I'll use a local example. We're accustomed to hopefully I'm talking to people who are accustomed to going to a site like the Archaeology Data Service. In my case, perhaps I might be more inclined to go to CANMORE, but don't tell Julian that, for information about sites or archives that we happen to be interested in researching. But what happens when you simply type archaeologydataservice.ac.uk into your browser? Yes, that page comes up, but what has actually happened in between those functions? It's triggered a whole host of complicated actions without us actually necessarily realizing, or indeed needing to realize, what's going on. At the operating system level, for example, you're accessing a kernel, a USB host stack, an input dispatcher, an event handler, a font hinter, a subpixel rasterizer, a windowing system, a graphics driver, and more. And that's even before you've got out as it were, of your computer into the network itself, because then there's a whole host of network actions that are going to get triggered, entailing DNS, TCP, UDP, IP, Wi-Fi, Ethernet, DOCSIS, OC, SONET, and more. And then there's going to be a whole series of browser actions entailing HTTP, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and so on. And all of that's before we've even actually hit the Archaeology Data Service server. And then, of course, once you've hit the server, the query is submitted to the database, and who knows what's going on in there. So a lot of this stuff is happening, hopefully. We'll come back to that. Or consider another example. How does Google Maps work? Not like that, to add. How does Google Maps actually work? It incorporates geographical information systems, geolocation satellites and transponders, human-driven automobiles, people walking around with funny things on their backs, roof-mounted panoramic optical recording systems, international recording and privacy law, physical data network routing systems, web mobile, presentation apparatus, plus, of course, the underlying unified data sets themselves. There's a huge amount of stuff going on underneath the surface of the tools that we are very, very accustomed to using all the time. So faced with this sort of complexity, when you start to sort of peel away the layers, how can we sensibly move forward? What do we, if you like, as end users need to know about our use of these tools? What should we understand? What can we reasonably understand? How much do we need to know about the ordering principles and the bases of the tools that we know? There's a lot of interest and debate outside archaeology currently in understanding the effects of algorithms, ranging from, for example, the online magazine Slate this month is running a series of algorithms. And the Journal of Science, Technology and Human Values that I showed earlier, that was a special issue published last month on governing algorithms that Maltazewicz edited. Now, the reasons why we should research the algorithms we use are paradoxically, I think, also the reasons why it's quite a difficult thing to do. So let me try and explain that. One problem is the issue of abstraction, which you can interpret in a number of different levels. So, for example, a computer algorithm will be taking a complex system from the real world, and it will abstract it into processes that capture some elements of that system's logic, but will discard others. So in that sense, algorithms are going to simplify and even distort what's going on. And these algorithms are linked with other processes to create software, and the software themselves are abstractions at a higher level. And indeed, much of what we perceive as data or documents that we create or record using these tools are, of course, themselves abstractions. In the machine, they only exist as patterns of electronic charge. And the effect of abstractions at any level, whether we're talking about algorithms or code or software, is to distance the user, whether that user is the programmer or the end user, from the need to be concerned with the low-level binary operation of the computer. And in the process, at the same time as they serve our purpose or purport to serve our purpose, these tools constrain and limit us in ways that we may not appreciate, because many of the systems we use abstract our control from the code beneath them. So software like WordPress, rather, for example, or other content management systems are an example of this. They remove the need to code or understand HTML in order to create web content, although in the process they frequently make it difficult to achieve certain effects. WordPress, certainly the public version of WordPress, has this really annoying function where you can do fancy stuff in HTML if you use their HTML view, but as soon as you switch back to their non-HTML view, it throws all your changes away. Took me a while to get my head around that one. So they can make it very difficult for us to achieve certain effects that we want. And this abstraction is one of the reasons why people and others have the idea that if the software is open source, we can then delve into that software, into the different levels of abstraction in order to understand the actual functionality of the software that we're using. But I don't think it's quite as simple as that might suggest. To start with, there's the question of transparency or opacity, depending on which side you like to come at this from. Akin to Sherry Turkle's classic characterization of computer systems as creating a seduction of simulation. It's a simulation in which we become accustomed to manipulating a system whose core assumption we don't understand. And I think if we're honest, that's true of much of the software. I don't really understand what's going on when I'm using QGIS, for example, half the time. I've started using structure from motion modeling software, and I really don't understand what's going on, other than it doesn't seem to do what I want it to do. And that's commonplace. I think that's something we've all become very much accustomed to. But one of the effects of that is it leads to the application of authority to that simulation, to the software, and I suppose ultimately to the people, the programmers who produce that software. But there are also different forms of opacity. For example, there's the sort of opacity that it is, in fact, associated with proprietary software, the sort of thing that open source proponents are concerned about. Software and elements of software that are concealed by patent and copyright to ensure corporate protection. It restricts what we can do with the software. Famously, often it even denies us ownership of the software. It simply licenses us to use it. And certainly it denies us the opportunity to disassemble it, to actually look under the hood in many respects. And at extreme, I suppose this can also include the possibility of deliberate deception. This is effectively, I suppose, what happened with the recent Volkswagen scandal as a classic example of this sort of opacity. And the response to these sorts of questions and issues is the argument that we should make the code available for scrutiny and audit. So, as I say, the benefits of open source come up here. And that's precisely what has been suggested in relation to proprietary engine management systems in the light of the discovery of the Volkswagen defeat device. Then there's opacity in the sense that simply writing and reading code is a specialist skill. One of the effects, I think, of increased abstraction is that actually fewer and fewer of us need to know how to code. This is where I'm going to start to sound like a bit of an old fart, because I remember the days when, you know, in order to teach databases to archaeology students, I had to first teach them how to program. And those days are long gone. So I don't teach programming any longer. Is that a problem? It certainly changes the nature of the understanding that people acquire about the tools that they're using. Nowadays, I think there's probably very few, if any, undergraduate archaeology courses that will involve programming. I'm happy to stand corrected. I think in most cases, it tends to be reserved for advanced master's programs, if at all. And I think this is actually one of the shortcomings of the open source argument, the assumption that we have the ability, let alone the time, to be able to understand the underlying code and what it's actually doing to our data. I don't know how complicated, for example, the Archaeology Data Services system is beneath that nice interface. But I'm sure it's not quite as complicated, for example, as Google's internet services, which apparently span some 2 billion lines of code. Windows is generally reckoned to consist of around 50 million lines of code. Facebook is estimated at 30 million. Now, of course, those are extreme examples. And lines of code is not necessarily a particularly good indicator of complexity, but any average desktop application that we currently use is going to consist of typically thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands of lines of code spread across a patchwork quilt of hundreds of program procedures and functions, which even to an insider, to one of the members of the programming team, can seem to be opaque spaghetti code. For example, this is LibreOffice, Microsoft Office's open source competitor. It currently has just over 7 million lines of code, for instance. And it seems to me very doubtful that any of the 1,500 contributors to that code base can have full knowledge of every component of the software. Now, of course, quick answer to that is document. Documentation is the answer. But as all programmers know, documentation is generally seen as being very unpopular. It's certainly rather boring, drudgery, and at the very least, if it's done at all, it tends to be left until last. And even then, it's the kind of documentation that is written for other people of like mind. It's not written for the likes of you and me who want to come along and say, well, okay, tell me what this is actually doing. It will disguise that description in pseudocode and complex computer science stuff that we have, again, to have a really high degree of computer literacy, to have a chance of understanding. So that the documentation is simply not going to be enough, at least as it currently stands. And of course, as we move on into the realms of the situation becomes even more complicated, because we're beginning to see that even the programmers themselves don't understand how computer software solves a problem. Last month, you probably saw, it was announced that DeepMind's AlphaGo beat the European Go champion 5 times out of 5. Now, AlphaGo was not programmed, apparently, to play Go. There are more possible board combinations in Go than there are atoms in the universe. That's 10 to the power of 170, I'm reliably told. So it can't be solved by algorithms that search exhaustively for the best move, like the chess playing algorithms do. So instead, AlphaGo learned using a general purpose deep learning algorithm that allowed it to interpret the game's patterns. First using information from expert games, and then refining it by playing itself across 50 different computers. And in fact, it was just announced, I think it was yesterday, in fact, I saw it in The Guardian, that they're about to take on the world #1 Go champion, and see if they can beat that person as well. Demis Hassabis is one of the founders of DeepMind, now a vice president of Google's AI projects, has great ambitions for this software, this kind of software. He says the system could process much larger volumes of data and surface the structural insight to the human expert in a way that is much more efficient, or maybe not even possible for the human expert. The system could even suggest a way forward that might point the human expert to a breakthrough. I have really mixed feelings about that. Part of me thinks, this is fantastic. Wouldn't that be wonderful? You know, this is serendipity, perhaps taken to its ultimate extreme. And the other part of me goes, I really don't want any of this. So I don't know where. It's difficult. You can very easily get caught up in the excitement of these sorts of tools and devices. So that's abstraction, opacity. There's also algorithmic prediction, something that we're all very familiar with. We're accustomed to the likes of Amazon's recommendations, for instance. This is just a quick insight to some of my reading habits. There are really two types of prediction going on here, preferential prediction and preemptive prediction. In preferential prediction, a process that the algorithms are going to anticipate your desires and offer options which it thinks are likely to please you. Whereas in preemptive prediction, the algorithm is actually going to delimit your access without providing with a choice, and quite often without you even realizing it's going on. Google's search autocomplete is an example of preferential prediction. Although, as we saw earlier this week, it can lay itself open to accusations of bias. You may have seen people notice the different results when you typed in Labour R, and then you typed in the Lib Dems R, and then for my home, you typed in the SNP R, but when you typed in the Conservatives R, you got nothing. And the sort of paranoia was twitching. You may have seen this in the news at the weekend. Quite what's going on, nobody really knows, and Google certainly isn't saying. But the suggestion is, in fact, we don't need to worry too much about this, because what it's actually showing is that the conservative predictions have been removed because they fall foul of the obscenity rule, which I thought was kind of wonderful. As I say, Google will not confirm or deny this, but it underlines the opacity of its predictive algorithms. We do not know what's going on. We don't know why these things are coming up. Twitter ran into similar problems a few years ago with the apparent disappearance or downgrading of the Occupy Wall Street movement's hashtags, and that led it to accusations of censorship. And quite dramatically, in 2011, Google ran into controversy when the Grindr app on its Play Store appeared to associate gay males with sex offenders, a link which was swiftly removed. You can just see in the related section on the left there, Grindr, they say related to Grindr, is this sex offender search app. As I say, the link was very swiftly removed when Google became aware of it, but it does underline, I think, that these algorithms are constantly and invisibly tweaked all the time. They are intentionally, and in some cases unintentionally, shaping the results, often in quite unexpected ways. Facebook's a good example of preemptive prediction. Many people, I'm surprised, but apparently many people are still unaware of that every time we open Facebook, it scans and collects everything that was posted recently by our friends, groups, and others. And then, according to a secret and constantly shifting formula, it ranks them into what it believes to be posts that you'll be interested in. And so what you see is this Facebook's own selection, which is why, friends that you haven't heard of for a while simply don't appear. You don't see any of their posts because Facebook has decided that you're not going to see them, despite the fact they are actually posting stuff. Many of the posts will never be seen, and furthermore, we will never know unless you go chasing that particular individual. Saying, "Why haven't I heard from you?" Oh, actually, you've been really busy on Facebook. So what on earth is going on? And that's the Facebook algorithm that's taking place. It creates this bubble in which we live that it thinks is tailored to our particular interests and desires. Whereas I think the reality is many of us, we've befriended people because we want to know what they're doing, what they're saying. Those of you who are Twitter users will doubtless be very aware of the fact this has recently, the last few days, blown up in relation to Twitter. Twitter was talking about changing its algorithm so that it would then feed you in a very similar way tweets that it thought you'd be interested in, rather than providing the chronological stream that it currently does. I believe they've backtracked a little bit from doing that because there was absolute uproar. But the Facebook algorithms are incredibly powerful and invisible. This automatic ranking effectively shapes our social lives and our reading habits. As was revealed in 2014, they can even make us feel happy or feel sad by changing that algorithm, by changing what they show us, by changing as only posts that have positive words in or only posts that have negative words in. And this study raised some really serious ethical problems. Again, you may have been aware of it because they didn't actually ask anybody before doing this to their feeds. So it, like Google's own search algorithm, effectively insulates us within a filter bubble that is allegedly tailored to our own particular interests and actions. Now, there's little doubt that they're doing this to try and be helpful. That's what there's no sort of necessarily ulterior motive beyond trying to be helpful. But the effect is that the algorithms selectively return results depending upon their knowledge of the person who asked the question. As Mike and Annie said in the context of the Grindr case, we should be more critical of what he calls associational infrastructures, technical systems that operate in the background with little or no transparency, fueling assumptions and links that we subtly make about ourselves and about others. The more we let systems make associations for us without challenging their underlying logics, he says, the greater risk we run of damaging who we are, who others see us as, and who we can imagine ourselves as. So I suppose in short, if we are thinking that these digital technologies are somehow neutral, that they are objective arbiters of good thinking, that they are rational systems that simply describe the world as it is without making value judgments, then we run into trouble, real trouble. And of course, I've concentrated here on algorithms. And whilst they're essential to computer work, the same issues actually apply elsewhere, I think, in the digital realm. So, for example, algorithms drive the collection, storage, and manipulation of our data, from the capture of data using digital devices, digital instruments, which themselves have algorithms embedded in them over which we have no control and often no knowledge for that matter. And that knowledge is embedded in the hidden algorithms in these instruments to operationalize the data that we collect within our computer systems, as well as the retrieval and processing of those data. So, in thinking about how to develop this as a case study, we could take any number of different examples. We could think about some sorts of digital instruments. Colleen, for example, has written about cameras, the effects of cameras on what we see and understand. And a lot of how sort of digital camera works is essentially invisible. We don't really know what effect things have in terms of the sorts of tools, facilities that a digital camera provides us with. When you turn on an anti-vibration device, what is that actually going to do other than hopefully not make it quite as fuzzy? It's doing something. Or we could take any sort of software that we currently use on a day-to-day basis, a database system or word processor, for example. Think about how that actually changes the way in which we approach things. But the example I'm going to use here, I apologize in advance for if anybody has exhaustively read my blog, because they'll have seen me working through this example. But I'm going to use this example because it's quite a high-level example. It doesn't involve me delving down into sort of hardcore techie stuff. And it's also an example that's very close to home. So as I said at the outset, hopefully it gives us an opportunity to develop the conversation with some of the experts already here in the room. So I'm going to look at sites, historic national monuments records. In Scotland, as I've mentioned before, we benefit from access to CANMORE, the National Monuments Record and allied archival resources that is maintained by Historic Environment Scotland. So I had to think about that for a moment. So what I did was go into CANMORE, and one of my passing interests has been for some years in Motte and Bailey castles. So I did a search in CANMORE for Motte and Bailey castles. I restricted the sites to Scotland because, in spite of what you might assume, CANMORE actually has got sites information in about sites beyond Scotland, simply because of some of the archives that it holds. So in fact, I had to filter out some English Motte and Bailey castles, which appear in the Brian Hope Taylor collection that the Royal Commission, Historic Environment Scotland, holds. So my search for Motte and Bailey castles in Scotland returned 42 sites. Brilliant. Now, I then went on to the Archaeology Data Service, and I'm going to be interested to see what people's answer to this is. It's a UK-wide catalogue, and we can use Arch search to repeat the search. So I selected Motte and Bailey from the monument types category, and I selected Scotland from the where category, and I got 438 results. So what's going on? Not quite what we might have expected. Now, fortunately, one of the really nice things about the, I've got to say something nice, one of the nice things about the ADS search is its faceted browser, because it actually does give you some interesting insights into what is actually going on beneath the surface. In fact, one of the things that is apparent is that the results are actually including records from the West of Scotland Historic Environment Record, which are duplicating records in CANMORE. So I've got duplicate sites appearing in my search here. So I can simply focus the research, the search in CANMORE, in the ADS, to the CANMORE records, the copy of the CANMORE records that it actually holds. Adjusting it to that search returns 339. So better, but still a long way to go. When you visually scan the results that are returned, one thing does seem to me to become clear. Arch search is actually using a fuzzy search, which I didn't know before, if I'm honest. And although the search criterion was Motte and Bailey, it's actually returning Mottes and Baileys and Motte and Baileys. Or is that Mottes and Baileys? I'm not sure. So as a final throw of the dice, I simply, admittedly in slight desperation, added the keyword Bailey to try and force it to look at Motte and Bailey castles. And that search gave me 48 hits, which at least is much closer. And it gives us an opportunity to actually do a side-by-side comparison to try and figure out what's actually going on. That side-by-side comparison, 42 records in CANMORE versus the 48 records returned by Arch search, shows that 8 of the Arch search records are sites that are not returned by CANMORE. Now, of those 8, 3 of them are just Baileys. Although one of them, which is Gallows Hill, which isn't included in the CANMORE results, is adjoining a Motte. So, you know, you thought, if a Bailey is adjoining a Motte, then why is it not actually classified as a Motte and Bailey castle? I have no answer to that. So maybe there's a problem there with the CANMORE classification. As well, 3 of the sites are not actually in Scotland at all, in spite of the fact that I've set Arch search to only return sites in Scotland. 2 of them actually come from the Brian Hope Taylor collection. So I was able to remove those effectively in CANMORE, but wasn't able to remove them from the Arch search set. One of them is a rather more interesting case. This is the castle at Liddell Strength, where in the CANMORE returns, it tells us that it's actually, it used to be in Scotland, but it is in Scotland no longer. The dot on the map, you can see this is the England-Wales border. So clearly at some point the border moved, and this castle is now in England, so it now appears in past scape, as well as in CANMORE, and the Archaeology Data Service is returning it. Interestingly, people living in Kirkandrews, Cumbria, will be interested to know they're actually according to ADS in Scotland, which might cause a few political hiccups. And then of the remaining, 2 of them are simply Mottes. So again, arguably should not have been returned. But as before, there's a bit of fuzziness about it. They're Mottes, but they might have possible Baileys associated with them. So CANMORE doesn't include them. The ADS fuzzy search does include them. So in the end, we can finally match about 40 of the records returned by both CANMORE and Arch search in response to the same search, with 2 sites missing entirely from the Arch search results. So where does this leave us? Well, one thing is clear. There are issues with both sets of data. There's no right and wrong in this particular game. Neither data set is complete, but then neither organization would claim that their data are ready to be used as is without some form of further data processing. And indeed, it's these sorts of discrepancies that get thrown up when this kind of data is made freely available, which is why in the past there's been reluctance to make these sorts of data sets freely available, because it tends to flag up the fact that there are actually problems with the data, which people perhaps have difficulty dealing with. But to come back to the sort of algorithmic theme that I was developing, I think more problematic is that what we had, at least on the surface, were two identical searches, Mott and Bailey castles in Scotland. And they generate widely differing results because the underlying algorithms, the underlying implementation of the searches is different, in spite of what it appears to be on the surface. So there are sort of filter bubbles in operation here. So the Arch search algorithm is using some sort of fuzzy search, despite the appearance of using a very specific classification. I specifically selected Mott and Bailey's, and there is actually a separate classification which I didn't use, which is selecting Mott's on its own. For some reason, the geographical restriction to Scotland isn't being comprehensively applied, and it's only through a sort of slightly fudged workaround that we get broadly similar results. Now, the sort of filter bubble is not perhaps as extreme as some. It's not perhaps as extreme as the Google search filter bubble, which is going to give different people typing in the same search criteria will get different results simply because of the effect of the search algorithm. That's not going to happen here. Two people performing the same search in CANMORE or two people performing the same search in Arch search will get the same results. It's just that one person performing the search in one tool, one person performing it in another tool, supposedly on the same data, will get different results. That will be incomplete in some respects, unless some effort is actually made to try and understand what's been returned. Now, to try and ensure I get out of here alive, I don't want to criticize either data provider. I think it's just really interesting. And it's a really interesting, I think, example, at a very simple level, of the ways in which the tools we use affect the results that we get in a very obvious sort of way. There's doubtless a really good explanation for this. And as I say, I'm kind of hoping I'll hear it. And certainly this isn't a fault that needs to be laid at either the providers of ADS or the providers of CANMORE. This is what happens when you make these sorts of large data sets available. The data sets have been collected over a very long period of time by lots of different people. They're subject to different sorts of processing and processes. They're presented via different interfaces and via different search tools. This is the sort of thing that happens when you do this. And it's far better that we should actually be able to access this data in the first place. I'm not suggesting we should just close it all down because, goodness me, there may be some problems with it. But as I say, what it does demonstrate are the challenges in making accurate and reliable data available, and the ways in which the algorithms that we're using can often disguise or conceal certain aspects or elements of that data, and the risks, therefore, that are inherent in combining and linking these sorts of data, particularly when we move into the realms of using automated techniques, such as natural language processing. So I think it should remind us that in various ways, the data that we use are contaminated. They're contaminated by methodological, theoretical, human, technical bias in all sorts of different ways. They're partial, they're selective, they're constrained by the conditions of their creation, the mode of their delivery. And that is all the more so when you then start to factor in not just the issues surrounding the data, but you start to factor in the issues surrounding the algorithms that have been used in the collection of that data and subsequently in the retrieval of that data. So the question, I think, then, at the end of all this, is how significant is all of this? I said it earlier on, there's a sense in which this could simply be an examination of the sort of technological fluff in our respective navels. How concerned should we really be about all of this? On the one hand, you could, I think, quite legitimately argue that we don't need to know the models of processing that are at work in these sorts of tools. And indeed, one of the attractions of using a very well-designed piece of software, a real sort of black box system, is the way in which it can seem effortless in terms of its use and arguably valuable to the work that we do. On the other hand, you might argue that the intuitive, action-situated nature of human intention, the inadequacy of many of the cognitive models, these things mean that the content of the black box should remain highly visible and highly accessible in order to allow for a much broader range of behavior and use. Now, to my mind, the value of an introspective approach, a digital detox, if you like, lies in the attempt to understand these sorts of issues of control, surveillance, power, politics, order, ethics, and structure that are associated with the information technologies we use, and which in turn influence how archaeological knowledge is created, represented, manipulated, modelled, and understood. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It was a wonderful talk, and I have some of the things you said actually resonated very profoundly with me, but I'll save my questions till the end. We do have time for a few questions, and I wonder if I could turn it to the audience. Does anyone have comments? Oh, Julian.
Should we step outside?
Enjoyed that tremendously, Jeremy, and I want to leave time for the more sort of general issues you raised, but I thought I should just respond on the sort of point of information question. That, yeah, our search uses natural language processing in searching the text of the records as well as the database fields in order to create this passive browse. So I think that explains the difference. I suppose the larger response, though, from me is it really so different to going to an academic library and picking up several books and finding that they have slightly different, written in different ages, different interpretations, different information, and one of the skills that hopefully we learn through education is critical faculties in analysing that. I'm sure you wouldn't be suggesting that we should close down academic libraries on the basis that people might get misinformation by picking up one book rather than another. And really, for me, the same applies in the digital age. We need to be critical of the sources we use, not just rely on one source.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. But I think there are two aspects of that I perhaps would highlight. One of which, I suppose, is that the big difference between going to a library and looking at an archive or a catalogue, a gazetteer or something, is that this stuff comes down to us at the push of a button. We've become very much accustomed to fast, immediate access to large amounts of data in a way that in the past you would have had to sit there and put a lot of work and effort into actually understanding and unpicking what was in a gazetteer, for example. So I think there's a sense in which one of the big differences is the immediacy of this stuff, the speed with which it actually arrives, which tends to perhaps encourage less of a questioning approach to it, unless you throw up particular problems with the data. But I think you're right, in a sense, there is no difference. I mean, the data, the same sort of issues underlie the data, whichever way you've captured it and recorded it. But I think perhaps the difference is that a classic gazetteer in the back of a book, the gazetteer is the gazetteer. There's not a whole lot we can do about it by the nature of the technologies via which it's actually delivered to us. With this technology, we could actually expect it to be much more transparent. We could actually, there is an opportunity to actually start to present, to unpick the reasoning, the logic, the theory behind the data that is being presented to us. There's an opportunity here, perhaps, to approach our data in a different way, rather than continue to use it in the same way as we have been for generations.
Gene.
Thanks very much. Yeah, that was very insightful. I was curious, there's sort of two parts to this. Firstly, how would you have given this talk differently if you were speaking to a room full of sociologists or anthropologists or data managers? And from extension, I think what struck me was your point early on, which is digital archaeology could be more ambitious. It shouldn't just be about methods and techniques. And yet I was struck by the fact that the algorithm example was more about method technique rather than the big theory, if you like.
Well, I think the first part first, I think I probably would have I think I probably would have said much the same, if I'm honest. It might have irritated them. But I think one of the things that is apparent when you're looking at some of the literature, the non-archaeological literature, is that a lot of it is the sort of sociologists and to some extent anthropologists who are starting to ask these sorts of questions, starting to sort of be that bit of sand in the oyster of computer scientists who are caught up in the excitement or thrill of developing all these wonderful new systems. And I think there's scope for archaeology to be part of that process because cultural objects, things are very much the sort of thing that we deal with. And what we're talking about here are cultural objects, material, in the physical form of computers and the way those computers operate. So I would like to think that there would be ways in which archaeologists could bring an archaeological eye to bear for the benefit of computer scientists and data managers and the like. I've completely forgotten what the second part of your question was. Sorry.
The use of algorithms. I can see how it's a theoretical concern about the general, following on from Julian's question about how we approach data. But in many ways, those steps are methodological and technical rather than the big theory. Maybe I don't put you on the spot, but how can we be more ambitious from a theoretical point of view?
Well, I guess my answer to that would be we have to walk before we run. I think the ambition is to be able to do precisely that. But the reality is that until we actually have this basic understanding of what these tools are doing and how they're changing things and how they're affecting the things that we do, we can't then move on to the next stage. So I think there's a sense in which I suppose my argument is that this process of introspection has to come first. But the problem with introspection is that you can take it to extremes. And it does become an exercise of inspecting the fluff in your navel. It does become a situation in which you become so introspective, you become completely freaked out and frozen by the whole thing. You recognize the fact that you are actually powerless to do anything about it. So introspection on its own is not enough. You have to be able to move beyond that. And I think that's the objective, but I don't think we're there yet.
My question actually, well, one of my questions kind of builds on what Jamie was saying, because Nicole and I, you know very well, did a critique of crowdsourcing and crowdfunding recently. And one of the reactions that we got was something that you said right at the beginning. A series of archaeologists responded saying that we were anti-digital, Luddites, etc. And I don't know anyone who would look at us and call us so then what happened is it was clearly a distraction tactic, because then all of a sudden you have to start defending, oh well, but I teach this, I do this, and again the pressure is taken off them to have to really reflect. And so I guess part of my question is then, how do you respond in that situation? So my response had been to then sort of deconstruct how they've reacted to it, to prove that they're reacting in exactly the same way that that testifies to the need for the critique. But I guess I wondered if you had, what's the strategy? How do you manage this? And it relates to the second question that I had, which is that, and you brought up this issue of the sort of kind of evangelical nature of a lot of the work that goes on. It strikes me that this is the same thing. The other thing is that the open source community often, I think, is slightly evangelical in its promotion of OS. And so you hinted at it there. What are some of the issues here? Time, capacity, skill, blah, blah. And so I guess I'm trying to figure out how to manage all of this and respond to the fact that you have to have that critique, and how do you not just spend all the time justifying the fact that, yeah, you're not a Luddite, et cetera, et cetera. How do you respond to that?
I wish I had an answer to that. But yes, it is very difficult, because I think there is always going to be this problem of overcoming a feeling is to say, well, why are you asking these questions? What possible value is there in doing this? Why should you as an archaeologist be asking questions about what are some of these things that are fundamentally computer science issues and data management issues and so on? Just use the tools, be thankful for the gifts that you're given, and get on with it. And I guess part of me just likes to be awkward and ask these sorts of questions, even if it annoys people. So just keep picking away. So what, and particularly if you can demonstrate ways in which these questions actually do raise issues which you can demonstrate and actually change things and actually have an impact upon the subject. Then I think that makes the whole questioning process that much more valid. So I think that would be one particular way of going forward. But it is very difficult, and it's very easy. I mean, I've certainly, looking at the way I've been approaching things over the last, 10 years or so, very much aware that you could very easily come to these things and basically just project a completely negative perspective on these things. That you do at least give this sort of impression of being a sort of nihilist as far as technology is concerned. The whole thing, or indeed the whole thing can sort of boil down to a form of technological determinism. This is all being driven by the technology, and we are sort of victims, if you like, of the technology. And I don't believe that either. But there's a very sort of delicate balancing act, I think, that we have to strike. And I think probably the approach is the one that says, well, I'm actually, I am an archaeologist. First and foremost, I am an archaeologist. I understand, I hope, what archaeologists do, what interests archaeologists, but I'm also interested in the tools and techniques that we use. I don't think anybody would seriously turn around and say to somebody, for example, who's doing a very detailed analysis and critique of how we excavate for the sake of argument. People say that's perfectly valid inquiry for an archaeologist to undertake. So why should an investigation of the digital techniques that we use not be equally valid in its own way?
Other questions, comments? No. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy. Lots to think about, and I very much appreciate you making the trip here. Thank you, and thanks all the